All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It is my great privilege to be moderating this panel today on climate justice and a just transition with such a distinguished panel of topic experts from around the world. So before I go on, I would like to share a very short video clip, which also features one of our speakers tonight.
各位朋友，我係莊陳友。氣候變化已經成為人類面對最大嘅威脅啦，而氣候變化亦都係最唔公平嘅一件事。有冇想象過，當你大量使用冷氣嘅時候，增加碳排放，氣候變化引致冰川溶解、海水上升，已經威脅到太平洋島最上面嘅居民，有部分有遷徙嘅計劃，可能成為氣候難民。又有冇想象過，當你過度消費嘅時候，引致碳排放、氣候變化，增加酷熱天氣，令到喺劏房裏邊居住嘅朋友有可能係喺室內中暑。當富裕地區嘅人嘅享受，引致喺貧窮處境下嘅人要埋單。呢個就係氣候不公義啦。
I'm pausing there as I would like to invite Mr. Chong to share his solutions a bit later in the panel. So again, a big welcome from me to you all. My name is Tze-wei. I'm a lawyer based in Hong Kong. So what is climate justice? To me, essentially, it means thinking about the dimension of inequality when thinking about climate change. As shown in the short video, who is responsible for carbon emission? Who is impacted the most by climate change and climate policies? And who has the power to make policies regarding climate response? Do we hear the voice of the most impacted in this policy making, whether it is a developing country in international negotiations or communities within a country in national policy making? It's become clear now that climate change impacts the poor and the vulnerable communities more than the average, from women to indigenous communities to elderlies. And oftentimes we will say that these communities suffer double or triple injustices. So for example, if you live in a poor quality, low income housing by the water, you will likely be more exposed to extreme weather like flooding or storms, but you're the least capable to cope with it. And if you're elderly or with disabilities, your ability to cope is even less. So this brings us to the principle of a just transition. Countries commit to reducing carbon emissions under Paris Agreement, but as we move towards greener economies, energy plants may be closed down, jobs made redundant, and communities may lose their main source of income. How can we make sure this transition to low carbon or green economy will leave no one behind, and that will bring the workers and communities that impacted the most along with us in this transition process? So today we have 4 speakers from very diverse backgrounds who will share with us why climate justice and a just transition matters to them, what they are doing in relation to these topics, and what more they think must be done. First of all, we have Imran, Khalid, Head of Environment and Climate Change at the Sustainable Development Policy Institute in Pakistan, who will share his international and experience within Pakistan on the challenges facing climate policies. We have Chong from Hong Kong, CEO of Carboncare InnoLab, who works with both government and young people to find climate solutions in one of the most unequal cities in the world. We have Dorah Marema, Head of Municipal Sustainability at the South Africa Local Government Association, a veteran climate justice professional, having founded several NGO initiatives on the topic, especially in relation to gender injustice, and most recently joining the public sector to work on sustainability policies at the municipal level. And finally, we have William David from Canada, where our competition host is based, also a veteran climate justice advocate working with the Assembly of First Nations as the Director of Lands, Territories, and Resources, who will share more about the impact of climate change on the indigenous communities here and his advocacy experience with both governments and in court. So without further ado, I'm going to start our first round of questions with our panelists. So let's start with Imran. The question is, what are you working on in relation to climate justice and just transition? What would you like to share with us today?
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. Let me begin by telling you a story of three girls, three school-going girls, or girls who should be in school but are not, across Pakistan. One is based in the Badin district on the coastal area of Pakistan. Climate change is resulting in sea level rise, which means seawater inundation and destruction of clean drinking water supplies. So as seawater comes in, it contaminates the clean drinking water supplies. And she and her family are now thinking of moving north to find a better place to live. There's a second girl. She lives in Dera Ghazi Khan, which is a district in the center of the country. Her home has been flooded 3 times in the past decade. Each time she's had to move out of her home and live in a government operated camp where she does not have access to clean drinking water. She does not have access to sanitation facilities. And this is a crisis that she's facing. There's a third girl that I want to talk about. She's living in northern Pakistan. Her family lives next to a river that is at the risk of flooding due to glacial lake outburst floods, or GLOFs. It is the same thing that has just recently happened in India, if you've been following the news, and that's resulted in deaths of a couple of hundred people. This happens because the glaciers melt, and then there's a dam formed, and that dam gives way, and the natural dam gives way to flooding, and that impacts the communities downstream. Now, none of these girls, all three of them, have done anything to cause the climate crisis. They haven't done that. Their communities haven't done that. And even their country has not played a major part in the climate crisis, but they are the most affected, right? They should be in school. They should be with friends. They should be thinking about their future, but now they're thinking about migrating and thinking about the climate crisis that's in fact affecting their livelihoods. And this is what climate justice is all about. This is what just transition is all about. It's about these young boys and girls across Pakistan and across the developing world, and even the developed world in some cases, who are bearing the impacts of the climate crisis. Now, Pakistan is one of the most affected countries when it comes to the effects of climate change. There's an organization in Germany called the German Watch Institute, and it regularly ranks countries which are the most affected. This year, it ranked Pakistan as number 8 on the top 10 list. Just to give you a bit of a background about Pakistan, it's the 5th largest country in the world by population, just behind Indonesia and just above Brazil, with a population of around 250 million people. So up in the north, we've got the Himalayas, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush mountain range. Down south, we've got the Arabian Sea, we've got deserts, we've got lakes and rivers. The Indus River system goes through Pakistan. So it's a geographical mix. It's a diverse country that makes Pakistan very interesting. But it is also the same diversity that results in us being vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So we're regularly hit by floods and droughts and heat waves and extreme weather events. This has implications for our collective well-being in terms of our food security, for example, in terms of our disaster response. So how do we move forward? These communities that I've just talked about, the 3 girls that I've just talked about, are the most are poor. They do not have the same finances and the resources that might be available to some others in the country. And this is where the governance structure comes in. It's important that the governance system caters to them in the same way that it caters to the rich. The rich community has a resource base and a support system to counter any potential risks from the impacts of climate change, while the poorer segments of the society do not. As such, these communities are living examples of social injustice, which is exacerbated due to the effects of climate change. It is this system of social injustice that needs to be addressed. This is what a just transition is all about, to ensure that no one is left behind, to ensure that the decisions being taken involve all stakeholders, including the ones who are most vulnerable. The stories of the three girls that I told you are being repeated across the world, and indeed across the world. And they're being repeated across Pakistan and indeed across the world. So any notion of a just transition needs to address their needs and their future. I'll just stop here, and if there are any questions, I can follow up. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran, for the stories of the three girls in Pakistan. So next we move on to a more urban context, hyper-urban context in Hong Kong. Chen Yao, can you please share?
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here. Hong Kong is one of the richest cities in the world, with GDP per capita surpassing some of the Europeans and richest nations. However, it is also one of the most divided societies in terms of wealth distribution. The Gini coefficient ranks among the highest. Now, so in the transition to climate change, transition to low carbon economy, some of the vulnerable groups may be left behind, and their conditions are already very vulnerable. So there are 200,000 people who lived in very crowded flats, what we call subdivided flats. So each 600 square feet flats may hold as many as 8 or 10 families. The hygiene condition is very bad. The air can be suffocating. The light is not good for children, especially. And there is also an issue of space affecting children growing up, not enough space in the indoor environment. During COVID-19, you would imagine that when people start to be more working from home, then the terrible conditions will take its toll. In climate change brings along extreme heat days. So over the past 6 to 7 years, in the past decades, were the hottest years of record. So people are predicting or warning that there can be health hazards for those who live in this kind of subdivided flat. They might be suffocated, they might have heat stroke. So all sorts of health issues. So if the government or society is not addressing their needs, the transition to a low carbon economy, the adaptation strategy needs to take account of the plight of these people, and we may very well be remembering about electric cars, reducing emissions, and that's all very well. That's our responsibility. But if we do not address the already horrible living conditions of this, some of our members of our communities, then the transition will not mean anything. Adaptation is as important as mitigation. And such transition reminds us that in building a new economy, we are not forgetting any of members of the community. So this is the issue. NGOs like us are working with traditional social work organizations. So it is an issue that can bring together environmental organizations and human rights organizations, as well as service organization and the residents themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanyo. And next, can we move to South Africa? Dorah, could you please share? Thanks.
Thank you so much also for this opportunity. It's really exciting for me to be involved in this. And I think, you know, as my colleagues Imran and Chanyo were sharing, it almost like felt like they were describing the situation in South Africa, obviously very similar. And I think, you know, I would like to highlight the issue of differentiated capabilities and differentiated responsibilities when we talk about climate justice, as well as a, you know, just transition to a low carbon development path. You know, always when we talk about these issues, we talk about the industrialized countries and the non-industrial countries, the big emitters and those who don't emit. But within these countries, there are people. And I think it's important to be able to not just generalize and cluster and talk about countries and continents, and rather, you know, have a human face. Who are we talking about? So within those countries, there are the same principle happen. You know, the same principle applies. There are different classes and groupings of people within the countries, and there are also men and women. There are also young people, there are children, right? And I think climate change really doesn't affect those people within those countries the same. You will find people who would be more vulnerable purely because of the way that they have been socialized, or because of their, you know, the place where they live, you know, the landscape or the place where they live. And I think it's important that when we talk about the issues of climate justice, we also realize that there are people who are vulnerable to climate change, who may not have caused it, right? And who may not even have the resources to be able to respond quicker to events, extreme weather events that are caused by climate change. So in South Africa, for example, we've got a lot of rural areas which still don't have access to energy services, access to clean water, and access to formal housing. And usually these are the people that are reliant heavily on smallholder agriculture. They farm in their backyards for their own consumption, and they sell little excess to be able to generate income. And unfortunately, these are the people that we have been seeing being affected heavily by the climate induced weather events, the floods, but also the El Nino and the La Nina, where there's extreme heat that destroys the crops and the livestock that they own. And it then all of a sudden then comes big floods, you know, that would destroy their homes. And they don't have access to insurance to be able to replace or to insure their crops or insure their homes. And they have been largely women who don't have the luxury to be able to move to cities because they remain behind to look after the children and the elderly in their homes. And unfortunately, you know, we don't have, you know, strategies that are sensitive to looking at this kind of differentiated impact. That, you know, it's not just saying the poor will be affected, or the people with less income? Who are those? And I think also when we talk about recently, there's been a study that has been conducted in South Africa that found out that of the 3 million people who lost their jobs because of COVID-19, 2 million are women. And it's purely because they are in less secure jobs. They are cleaners. They are people, who look after the children. And immediately when they are no longer needed, or they are the people who are hired them lose their income, they are first to go. They are not able to get easily to their jobs, and as a result, they are the least. They are the easily sacrificed. And I think as a result, we really need to be able to pay attention to this. That it's not about just countries; it's about humans in those countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorah. So next, we move to Canada. William, can you share your experience here?
Yeah, thank you. William David, I'm pleased to be joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, where I am today. I just want to start by suggesting climate justice and just transition. Each of the speakers have been talking about this, but it implies that there's some sort of injustice that could be exacerbated if not addressed through just transition. It's consequential because there are many different kinds of injustice in the world, and how that injustice plays out for Indigenous peoples often is a direct result and is in fact magnified or can be magnified by climate responses. In this country, Indigenous peoples did not really and have not seriously benefited from most of the global economic order. Indeed, most Indigenous peoples in Canada were dispossessed of all of their lands, territories, and resources, precisely so that the colonizing governments could then reap the resources for their own economic benefits. So in a very real sense, not only have Indigenous peoples not benefited, but in fact have suffered from the current state of the global economy. That issue of dispossession is live, and particularly when paired with issues like just Indigenous invisibility of Indigenous laws, relationships to our lands, or invisibility of Indigenous knowledge about potential climate solutions, really combines to have fairly disproportionate impacts on Indigenous peoples. What does that have to do with Canada? Well, if Canada, for instance, wanted to transition away from hydrocarbons for fuels or for other forms of energy development, it means that Canada would probably then have to incur further into First Nations lands, territories, and resources, causing further damage. And it's not just a matter of being able to possess the lands. We're talking about access to be able to engage in harvesting activities. Something like 93% of First Nations individuals in Canada still consume traditional foods. So issues like food security, issues like access to lands, other issues out there that particularly impact Indigenous peoples, such as changing weather cycles, can have any number of impacts on the ability to conduct spiritual ceremonies, which is a real problem. Are out there. So the response measures, if you just respond without addressing the underlying injustices, and it's true no matter what the injustice is actually going to exacerbate that marginalization and that injustice to the point where you can see someone like myself suggesting if one wanted to build like a new economy based on renewable fuels, but one which actually impacts and causes that much more harm and damage to Indigenous peoples, not only would I not necessarily be supporting it, we would probably be lining up to resist those actions. And indeed, you can actually see those kinds of challenges starting precisely because the dominant governments, such as they are, make a choice not to deal with the underlying forms of marginalization that are out there. And they make a choice to have a transition rather than a just transition. And so I just want to conclude by suggesting that we all have choices that we can make. Governments can make choices to have more equitable relationships between governments. We can choose to have an economic system that actually works for everybody. You can choose to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. You can also choose just to tolerate the system as it is, but doing so is not only going to undermine the ability to actually have a just transition, it's really going to undermine the ability to have any meaningful or effective response to climate change, and indeed threaten all of humanity. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, William. So yeah, thank you for to our panelists for this first round of sharing. As we hear that climate justice is also about thinking about the inequality dimension, how it could exacerbate existing injustices. I think during our discussion, we can also hear that there may be a chance for us to also use policy response at this moment to address some of those structural injustices, to make use and address some of the missed opportunities in the past. So the second round of questions is really, I would like to hear from the panelists. Can you share a little bit more about what you're doing right now? Who else do you think needs to act on just transition, climate justice? And what are some of the things we can do to right the wrongs with our policy responses at this moment? So I'm going to mix up the order of the speakers a little bit. William, are you ready? Do you want to go first? I particularly love how you mentioned just now that we all have choices. And so when we look at who is able to act, I would love to hear from you more on that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of like what I do is, I did mention like one of the broader issues I have is just with lands, territories, and resources. So part of that is pairing the right for recognition to a meaningful just transition and a meaningful response to climate change. There's a lot of ways to do that. For instance, granting Indigenous peoples, recognizing Indigenous territorial rights, you know, in exchange for Indigenous peoples being able to manage their lands in a fairly sustainable fashion rather than engaging in hydrocarbon development via conservation easement. But the other thing that I tend to work on a fair amount is trying to encourage and increase the Indigenous voice broadly in climate discourse. And that really is not just limited to those smaller issues related to land rights, but is really being able to articulate, for instance, what are some of the spiritual dimensions of climate change, being able to articulate how Indigenous traditional knowledge can be useful or helpful, particularly for local responses, but also for global ones, and convincing policymakers to really address some of the underlying poverty within Indigenous communities. The reason why explaining that and removing that invisibility is important is because it can help to increase understanding within Canada specifically, which is predominantly where I work, but also globally. So being able to situate Canada in a position as a country to suggest that they actually need and they have an obligation to work with and support Indigenous peoples in other countries, but also more broadly the global discourse. It's a relatively small country with a relatively small economy, but Canada can actually do a lot to help. And then on top of that, while it may be a relatively small player in the global negotiations, as I said earlier, it's a major hydrocarbon producer and just should recognize that we have a moral responsibility. That's as a country. But really, I mean, to someone like me, any kind of effective climate response has to unwind a lot of the injustice that's already in the world. And I think there is a conscious choice that anybody can make, no matter what kind of issue you work on, to actually recognize that that injustice exists and then to craft a response that, I should say, that does not exacerbate the injustice and hopefully addresses it. And it really is like, that's a choice. So in a very real way, a lot of the issues that I work on, I'm kind of trapped by history and colonialism. A lot of my partners are trapped in a colonial mindset as well. It's a choice that we have to not recognize that and continue, or to recognize that and try to address it. Just because, you know, we can be trapped by the past. We don't have to be trapped by the future though. And we actually have the ability to change that. And that's something that extends not just to Indigenous peoples or marginalized peoples, it is something that is necessary for people that are more in the dominant discourse. So your economic and political elites to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for highlighting that. Definitely is about including the voices of indigenous communities in this particular instance, but also recognizing that they have much to offer and solutions also that have been used in all their times to address the issues that we are facing right now. So thanks for that. Next, I'd like to move on to Imran. Can you share a bit from Pakistan's experience, what else needs to be done? And yeah, and like, what are you doing right now? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So as a researcher, we try and work with the communities, try and see how the climate change crisis is impacting communities on the ground, and then recommend to the policymakers what actions need to be taken in terms of a sustainable response. As far as the response to climate change is concerned, I think we need a collective response. But at the international level, those countries who bear the responsibility of putting us in this position bear most of the responsibility in this regard. So the developed world will need to take the lead here. The change of administration in the US is definitely a step in the right direction, if I may say so. But more needs to be done. At this time, if we continue at the same level of emissions, we'll quickly cross over the 2.5 degrees centigrade mark. In order to address this challenge, we need to move towards a carbon-free economy as early as possible. So governments have come in and said, look, we'll get there by 2050. I think that might be a little bit too late. We need to ensure that we keep the warming to as little as possible. And the Paris Climate Agreement highlighted 1.5C. I think that's a good starting point, because if you go beyond that, we know that there will be an ecological crisis that we might not be able to handle. So in this respect, the developed world can help by moving us to a carbon-free economy on its own. And then secondly, help the developing world transition to a carbon-free economy as well. Because even though countries like Pakistan do not contribute as much to global warming, little by little it all adds up, and we are contributing to it, right? So we'll need technical expertise here, we'll need financial expertise. That's going to be important. Role of China and India is also going to be important here. They have been developing countries, and they're also suffering from the impacts of climate change, but as they're growing, they're contributing to it as well, right? So there is that part. One other aspect of climate justice is addressing what's known as loss and damage. This is a term that often comes up in our climate negotiations. And this is something that the developed world, developed countries really shy away from. This is about addressing the costs that communities incur due to floods and droughts and heat waves. And this is something that the developing countries, those countries that are most impacted by climate change, are having to deal on their own. They do not have the resources. So here too, the developed world needs to realize that it has some kind of a responsibility in terms of addressing these challenges. As far as the developing countries are concerned, I think they need to focus on adaptation. They need to focus on ensuring that the stakeholders in their own countries are ready in terms of meeting the challenges that have been brought forth by the climate crisis. So this will mean ensuring that they have enough resources, the technical, the financial, other kind of help that is necessary to adapt to whatever is happening around them. So what we're looking at here is an international response and then a local response that will cater to the needs of everyone, especially those who are most vulnerable across the world. I think it can be done. It's just that we really need to set our minds to it.
Thank you, Imran, for highlighting that need for both action at the international level and at the local level. You also work with community, as I understand. So next, I'll pass it to Chen Yao. Maybe that is also one aspect that is a key focus of what you do. So maybe you can share a little bit more on what you do with the community side as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, in responding to the issue that I raised as an example of just transition, the importance of adaptation. So it's not just about crowded housing conditions, it's also about unemployment. It's also about hygiene, transportations, and so on. So solutions. Well, we are doing several things at local solution level. You can have policy goals and policy framework, and also commitment by government. That is the primary importance. For that, we are monitoring. Okay, we are writing a report to monitor the government's performance. On local solutions, while the big solution is not yet achieved, we are discussing how to develop engineering solutions as devices which will help to alleviate the living conditions of those who live in subdivided flats before they can be moved, have a chance to be moved to more decent housing. So we have engineering students thinking about how to develop simple devices to improve air circulation, lighting, and so on. In terms of building a solar, a clean energy communities, we are developing solar systems with NGO making use of their rooftops space and so on. And in terms of addressing the issues of health, hygiene, we're doing a study. We'll be doing a community dialogue with the people who can raise their concerns. And so all these are the kind of solutions that we believe that the community can take things into their own hands, while at the same time, as citizens, we demand government actions.
I think, I mean, for me, the most important thing is the work that needs to be done both at the international level, but also at the community level. And I think the local level needs to inform the international level. And I think it's important to make sure that the local communities are capacitated to be able to build their own communities around the issues of resiliency, making sure that they're focusing heavily on adaptation with those that are in cities and places where they are they can consider the other interventions that are mitigation interventions. But I think it's critical that local people together with local government are playing a very critical role in building and creating climate resilient communities. The people's livelihoods are impacted. It's not something in the future. It is something that is happening right now in the present. And a lot of these interventions, they need partnerships, both local to local partnerships, national partnerships, but also international partnerships. They need a lot of financial support. And I think there has been the attitude, or I think an approach that doesn't quite trust the local. So funds are transferred, but they always get stuck in the national, and they don't. And there's an assumption that they will somehow trickle down to the local level. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we are making. We need funds to trickle down to the bottom line, to the bottom part of the country, where people are already adapting, and they need solutions to be able to scale up that which that they're already doing, because it doesn't make any sense to design an adaptation fund at an international level that doesn't speak to the local issues, that doesn't have a direct access mechanism where our people are able to access these resources directly, and they don't need billions of rands, and we have seen in other instances where funds are going to building walls to shelter, I'd rather not wear my activism hat, but and I think it's important that we pay attention to the issues of the smallholder farmers, who are really the lifeline of communities. And we have seen it even during COVID, when the economy closed down, when food couldn't be transported to cities, from cities to cities, where the local community was able to feed themselves. And we need to actually pay attention to that. And I think if we are embarking on really grand plans to mitigate the impacts of climate change and to adapt to the impacts of climate change that are not speaking to the communities with whom we are saying we are serving, and it's always numbers. So many people will be affected. The poor will be affected, but we do not actually understand the dynamics. We do not understand the kind of resources that they need. The adaptation fund, if it's coming, it needs a lot of paperwork. Adverts are made on the internet, and they assume that the people are able to access this. And I think, unfortunately, it excludes a lot of people. I mean, I have the luxury of working in local government from last year, September. And I can tell you that the desperation that is there at the local level. And I think there can be partnerships with universities to conduct research to understand exactly how climate change manifests itself in that low level. The governance issues, lots of education and training. People are still stuck in business as usual. Plans are still being approved, and we need to start looking at integrating climate change into all of these planning mechanisms to make sure that we need to start asking the right questions. If this development is going to be implemented the same way, and it's built in the same way that we have done in the past, and it doesn't ask the right questions about climate change, climate proofing of infrastructure, and all of these things, we are going to see a lot of these disasters reoccurring. And we need to learn, and I think we need to have transformational adaptation. And I understand that there's been adaptation, but it has to be transformational. It has to result in a change that is fundamental, that has got people in the heart of it, and actually taking hands with them to be able to understand how they understanding at climate change, how they are already adapting, so that we can strengthen that. And I think the local level of government is the most important one and the most neglected one. And I read a report that mentioned that a lot of funds have been pumped into climate change adaptation, and a fraction, I think it's like about 10%. I think it was an IIED report that said that climate finance is available, but only 10% of it goes to the local communities, to the most directly affected people by climate change. And that this needs to change. This picture must change. And that's what we are doing right now in my organization, to try and work with local government to mainstream climate change within all of their operations, but also to make sure that we are also attracting partners to come and partner with them there at the local level, to build on what they already are doing, on what they know, so that they can amplify it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorah, for that very powerful sharing. I think I need all four speakers have really highlighted some very different dimensions of climate justice and just transition, but some common themes I'm hearing is climate justice is about really understanding the issues, whether it's international, national, whether it's current, past injustices, whether it's vulnerable communities within a country context, but it is also very much an attitude about when you're making policies, where do you put your emphasis, really bringing it down to the community, listening to the individuals in the community, how they're experiencing climate change and how your policies impact them. So before we end, can I invite you four to give a 30-second tip or reminder or sharing with our student participants who are going to brainstorm on climate solutions in this competition. So what would be a gem that you want them to take away tonight or today?
I think we can't just celebrate small community projects like the ones I was involved in before I joined this association. It has to be countrywide. It has to be countrywide, it has to be continent-wide solutions that we are coming up with. We need to connect these smaller projects into something that will catch fire and eventually cover the whole ground. And we need people here. We need researchers, we need policy people, we need trailblazers, we need champions. Thank you.
This can only be resolved through collective action. Everybody has to come together. The first step is to learn about the crisis and understand that you're part of this event and you're part of the resolution. And the second is to start a climate conversation with those who are not aware of the situation. I think what we're doing today is part of that climate conversation. This is a conversation that needs to continue, not only with your family members, but with your friends, with your teachers, with your neighbors. And hopefully that will be a start when it comes to the resolution of this crisis. We need to talk about mitigation. We need to talk about adaptation. We can talk about technology. We can talk about the local impacts and how we need to resolve this at the local level. But before we do all that, let's have this conversation. And I think what we're doing today is part and parcel of that. Thank you.
On that note, thank you Convergence.tech for organizing and all the panelists for your sharing, for being with us tonight. And to our student participants, good luck, have fun. We need your ideas and be a change maker beyond this competition and start that conversation. Goodbye.